In this video we're going to do some basic subdivision surface modeling, and we're going to create this smiley face. Simple shapes like these are perfect for practicing, and you can learn a lot about modeling when doing shapes like these. We're not just going to do one version of this smiley, we're going to take this a step further, and in this first video I'm going to show you one way of modeling this smiley face, and in another video I'm going to show you a couple of different versions that I created of this object, and we're going to compare those versions, and we're going to try and find out what the advantages or disadvantages of each of these versions might be. So let's get started by adding a reference image. So I'm switching to the front view. Let's go to Options, Configure, and here on the back tab we can load our reference image. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. There's no particular reason why I'm doing this. I also want to increase the transparency. And now we can get started. So usually when modeling you go from the bigger shapes and the rougher details to the smaller shapes and the finer details, but in this case we're going to do it the other way around, because it's just better to do the details first, because we can figure out the geometry, and once we have the geometry for the eyes and for the mouth, we can then determine how many polygons we need for the head. Let's start by creating the mouth, and I'm going to keep this fairly low poly. So for the mouth I'm going to do one polygon for the corner, and I guess in order to get a nice looking curve we need at least 2 polygons for this curve up here and for the curve down here. So let's grab our polygon pen tool, and we can start creating a polygon by just left clicking to create the points, and we're going for 4-sided polygons. So for the last point I'm going to double click to create the polygon, and we could continue doing this by left clicking and creating more polygons, but that's actually not the best way to use the polygon pen tool. A much faster and more efficient way of creating polygons using the polygon pen tool is to hold down the control key and then left click and drag on an edge, and we can create polygons like this. So this will be much faster. So I'm going to create 2 polygons here, and for the bottom of the mouth we also need 2 polygons, because we need to make sure that the geometry matches with the top of the mouth here. And because our object is symmetrical, we're only going to do half of this object, and then we're going to use symmetry. I'm going to select these points here at the center, and we need to make sure that these are at 0 on the x-axis, so I'm going to set the position and the size of these points to 0. In order to be able to tell how this shape looks, we have to subdivide it. So let's add a subdivision surface object, and you can see we're not really following the shape in the reference image. So let's select our polygon here, and I'm going to start moving some points around, and then we can use the polygon pen tool and move some edges and try to get closer to the shape that we see in the reference image. And maybe up here I'm going to move this edge down a bit to get a nicer curve going. So something like this maybe. Next we're going to do the eye, and because the eye is circular we can start with a disk object. And I'm going to switch the orientation of the disk to -z, and let's move this into position over here. And I'm going to switch the display to wireframe so we can see the geometry. We don't need any segments here, so let's reduce those to 1. And let's make this a little bit smaller. Right now we have way too much geometry on this disk. So let's reduce the number of rotation segments. And I'm going for something fairly low poly here. The minimum number we could use is 5 rotation segments in order to still get a circle. However, using 5 rotation segments also means we would have 1 triangle. So in this case I'm going for 6 rotation segments so we can make sure that we only get 4-sided polygons. If I put this disk in a subdivision surface object, you can see that the object is shrinking. It's a lot smaller than the shape in the reference image, and that's because we're using only a couple of polygons. If I select the disk and increase the rotation segments, you can see the more segments I add, the closer the subdivided disk gets to the shape in the reference image. But we're going to keep this low poly here. So what I'll do instead is I'll just scale that disk up a little bit and match it up with the reference image. So now we can select our mouth and the eye, and I'm going to right click and use connect objects and delete to turn these into a single object. So next we're going to connect the eye and the mouth. And first of all I'm going to select these points here and maybe rotate them a bit to line the geometry up a little better. And then we can use the polygon pen tool, hold down Control, left click and drag on this edge, and we can create more polygons here. And we could also connect these two edges here. And maybe let's move some points around. I'm going to move this up a little bit, maybe move this one up a little bit, and this one as well. I'm going to select all the points at the center again and make sure they're at 0 on the x-axis so we can use symmetry later and mirror this object over to the right. So now we have the basic geometry for the mouth and for the eyes, and when we count the edges you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 edges here. So that means for the head we need a disk that has 12 rotation segments. So let's add a disk to the scene, and let's change the orientation to -z. We don't need any segments. And let's scale this up. And let's change the rotation segments to 12. And if I subdivide this disk, you can see that again the subdivision surface object is shrinking the object because it's quite low poly. So let's select the disk and scale this up a little bit. I'm going to switch off the subdivision surface object. For the disk I'm going to use an inner radius so we can create a polygon loop, and that will make it a little bit easier to connect the geometry. So now we can select our disk and the mouth and the eyes and use connect objects and delete to turn these into a single object. I'm going to delete some of these subdivision surface objects here. Because we're going to use symmetry, we can select the points on the right and delete them. And now we can start closing those holes in the geometry. And I'm going to use the polygon pen tool again to create the polygons that I need here. We still have some triangles here on the eye, so I'm going to remove those by going to Edge Mode, selecting these 4 edges here, and we can simply dissolve these edges. So now we have 4-sided polygons. And for now I'm also going to delete these edges here. So let's dissolve these edges, and we can also get rid of these edges here for now. So I'm going to select those, and let's see, maybe we could also select these edges here and then use stitch and sew, and then just left click and drag from this point down to this point to get rid of this edge loop. I also want some thickness for this object, so let's select the edges on the outside, and I'm going to use quick extrude by holding down the control key, left clicking and dragging, and we can also hold down the shift key to move these new edges in increments of 10, and let's do maybe 40 centimeters here. And I also want to close this object at the back, so let's grab the polygon pen tool again, and let's create a polygon here. Then in edge mode I'm going to ring select these edges and use connect points edges to create an additional edge, and then I'm going to use the polygon pen tool again to close these holes back here. So you can see we have 4-sided polygons at the back as well now. I also want to close the mouth, so let's add 2 more polygons here. And now we can put this in a symmetry object, and we could tweak some of the points if we want to. So let's go ahead and maybe select this point down here and move it up a little bit. And I'm going to move this point up a little bit. And maybe let's move this point down a little bit again. So something like this. If I switch on the subdivision surface object and put our smiley head in there, you can see we're getting pretty nice looking topology here. Next I'm going to extrude the eyes and the mouth. So we're going to do that in polygon mode. Let's select these polygons here, hit D for extrude, and let's extrude those back a bit. Something like this maybe. Now you can see we have this polygon here at the center, and we have to get rid of this. We could of course delete this manually, but we also could change the settings of the symmetry object. If we check clamp points on axis, we will have access to delete polygons on axis, and that's what we're going to check as well. So now we're getting rid of this polygon here at the center. And now we can make the symmetry object editable. And if we subdivide this, you can see the shapes are still very soft. That's because we don't have any control edges yet. So I'm going to switch to edge mode, and let's use the loop selection tool to select the edges where we need to add control edges to hold the shape. and I'm going to use the bevel tool, and we're going to do a solid chamfer, and an offset of 10 may be a bit much, so let's bring this down to maybe 7. If you want the edges to be sharper, feel free to reduce the offset a bit more. You can also see that we're getting some weird looking geometry in some of these corners here. We can easily fix that by changing the metering from default to uniform. And now we're getting proper geometry here. So in this video we've seen one way of doing this object. In the next video I'm going to show you a couple of different versions that I did of the same object, and we're going to compare those versions.